You know, it's funny how your life can be measured in houses. Most people have a childhood home. Maybe a starter apartment, the house where they raise their own kids. For me, it's different. My life is cleanly split into two distinct parts. Everything that came before the farmhouse. And everything that came after. Before the farmhouse, the world was a relatively simple place. It had rules. It made sense. After the farmhouse, after the farmhouse, I learned that the world we think we know is just a thin, fragile veneer stretched over something much older and infinitely more terrifying. And that sometimes, the locks on your doors aren't meant to keep things out. They're meant to keep things in. This all started in the winter of 1970. I was the oldest of 5 girls. My name is Andrea. My father, Roger, was a truck driver. A good man who worked himself to the bone for his family. My mother, Carolyn, was the absolute heart of our home. She was this vibrant, loving woman who could make a palace out of a cardboard box. We were a close family. A bit chaotic with 5 daughters running around. But we were happy. We were living in a small home in Cumberland, Rhode Island, and with the family growing, we were bursting at the seams. So, my parents started looking for a new place. A forever home. A place with land where we girls could run and scream and play without bothering any neighbors. And then they found it. The Arnold Estate, in Harrisville, Rhode Island. To say it was a dream come true would be an understatement. From the moment we first saw it, it felt like stepping into a storybook. It wasn't just a house, it was a genuine 18th century colonial farmhouse, set on 200 acres of pristine New England countryside. It was this massive, gray, saltbox-style building with a huge central chimney, weathered by centuries of wind and snow. The property had stone walls crisscrossing through fields and forests, a gentle brook, and a massive barn that was bigger than the house we were leaving. I remember standing there on that first visit, the crisp winter air biting at my cheeks, just staring up at it. It looked important. It had a presence. It felt like it had been waiting for us. We girls immediately scattered, running through the 10 sprawling rooms, our shouts echoing off the wide plank floors and plaster walls. We claimed our bedrooms. We planned forts. We imagined the lives we would live there. My parents were just as enchanted. They saw it as their slice of the American dream. A place to put down roots. A legacy. Looking back, there was one tiny, discordant note on that perfect day. It was almost nothing. Just a comment from the old farmer who was selling the place. As we were leaving, he pulled my father aside. He was a quiet, stoic New Englander, not one for idle chatter. He looked my dad square in the eye and said, with a seriousness that seemed out of place, "For the sake of your family, leave the lights on at night." My dad just kind of laughed it off. He figured it was just an old man's quirky way of saying the wiring was old or that it got dark out in the country. We all forgot about it. We were too busy dreaming about our new life in the big, beautiful house on the hill. We had no idea we were about to walk willingly into a nightmare that had been festering in that soil for nearly 150 years. We moved in at the very end of 1970. The first few weeks were pure, unadulterated chaos and joy. Unpacking boxes, the smell of my mother's cleaning supplies mingling with the scent of old wood and earth. The constant sound of 5 girls laughing and exploring. The house was a labyrinth of discovery. We found old bottles in the walls, yellowed newspapers from the 19th century under the floorboards. It was our kingdom. The first strange thing was so small, so insignificant, that it barely registered. My mother was a meticulous housekeeper. Everything had its place. One morning, she came into the kitchen and found the broom, which she always kept in the pantry, leaning against the counter in the middle of the room. She just assumed one of us girls had used it and forgot to put it back. She scolded us. We all denied it, and that was that. A total non-event. But then it happened again the next day. And the day after. The broom would be moved. Sometimes it was just in a different corner. Once, we found it standing perfectly balanced on its bristles in the center of the kitchen floor. A feat that seemed almost impossible. It became a running joke. The phantom sweeper, we called it. We were still in that blissful stage of rationalization. It had to be one of us playing a prank. It had to be. Then came the sounds. At first, they were subtle. The house was old, so we expected creaks and groans. But these were different. They were purposeful. You'd hear what sounded like a quiet scraping noise coming from inside the walls of the kitchen pantry. We'd open the door, and there would be nothing there but shelves of canned goods. Then, we started hearing noises from the cellar. It was a dark, musty place with a dirt floor that we all hated. At night, when the house was supposed to be silent, you'd hear a dull, rhythmic thumping coming from below the floorboards. Bump, bump, bump. My dad, ever the pragmatist, went down there a dozen times. He checked the furnace, the water heater, the foundation. He never found a source for the sound. He told us it was just the house settling. We wanted to believe him. My younger sisters, Nancy and Christine, were the first to see things. Christine, who was only 5, started talking about a man she saw in the corner of her room at night. She said he was tall and thin and just stood there, watching her with a sad smile. We told her it was just a bad dream, that her eyes were playing tricks on her in the dark. But she was adamant. Then Nancy saw a dark, shadowy figure glide down the hallway and disappear into the living room. She came screaming into my parents' bedroom. Again, a nightmare, an overactive imagination. That's what we told ourselves. It's amazing, the stories you'll invent to maintain the illusion of safety. The atmosphere in the house began to change. That initial feeling of wonder and joy started to curdle into something else. A quiet, creeping unease. You'd walk into a room and the air would suddenly feel heavy and cold. Not just a draft, but a penetrating, unnatural chill that would raise the goosebumps on your arms in the middle of July. It felt like walking through invisible cobwebs. And there was always the feeling, the unshakable, prickling feeling on the back of your neck, that you were being watched. You'd be alone in a room, reading a book, and you'd just know you weren't alone. You'd look up, and there would be nothing there. But the feeling would linger. A silent pressure in the air. My mother seemed to be the focus of it more than anyone. Little things at first. Her favorite sewing basket would vanish from its spot and reappear in the attic. A window she had just locked would be found wide open. And then came the smells. A cloying, sickly sweet scent of rotting flowers would suddenly fill a room. So thick you could almost taste it. And then vanish just as quickly. Other times, it was the smell of pond scum and decay. A stench that would rise from the drains even after my father had cleaned them thoroughly. The turning point, the moment when we could no longer pretend this was all in our heads, happened one morning at precisely 5:15 a.m. I was shaken awake by my bed vibrating. It wasn't a gentle tremble, it was a violent, teeth-rattling shaking, as if someone had grabbed the footboard and was trying to tear it apart. I shot up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. My sister Cindy was in the bed next to mine, her eyes wide with terror. Her bed was shaking too. The entire room seemed to be vibrating with a low, humming energy. It lasted for maybe 30 seconds. And then it just stopped. We ran into our parents' room. My father was already awake. His bed had been shaking too. We found out later that my other sisters, in their separate rooms, had all been woken up at the exact same time by the same violent shaking. My father, a man who could find a rational explanation for anything, had no answer. There was a look in his eyes I'd never seen before. Genuine, unadulterated fear. After that, the dam broke. The slow burn was over. The house, it seemed, was done playing games. The paranormal activity became a daily, unavoidable part of our lives. It was as if some invisible floodgate had opened, and the full force of whatever resided there was now crashing down upon us. The disembodied voices were no longer whispers. They were clear as day. You'd be walking down the hall and hear a voice right behind you cry, "Get out!" You'd spin around, and no one would be there. We'd hear crying, moaning, and sometimes, a cruel, cackling laugh that seemed to echo from the very walls of the house. The physical manifestations became more brazen. Doors would slam shut with hurricane force. Even on windless days, drawers would be pulled out, their contents dumped on the floor. In the kitchen, my mother would watch in disbelief as a chair would slide across the floor on its own. The phantom sweeper was no longer a joke. We'd find piles of dirt swept into the center of the kitchen, despite the floors having been cleaned just hours before. Whatever was in the house had distinct personalities. Some of the spirits seemed almost benign, if mischievous. My younger sisters often felt a gentle, spectral kiss on their foreheads at night, which they attributed to a motherly spirit. There was another presence, a younger boy, who they said would playfully touch their toys. But these moments of seeming gentleness only made the malevolent presences stand out in starker relief. There were two dominant, evil entities. The first was what we came to call the hag. Her presence was always accompanied by that putrid smell of decay and a suffocating cold. She was the one who seemed to enjoy pure, psychological terror. She would appear mostly to my mother. Mom would be lying in bed and would see the silhouette of a woman with a broken, twisted neck, her head hanging at an unnatural angle, standing in the corner of the room. She would just stand there, radiating pure hatred, before slowly fading away. This entity, we later learned, was believed to be the spirit of a woman named Bathsheba Sherman. The historical records we managed to dig up were horrifying. Bathsheba had lived on the property in the early 19th century. She was a practicing Satanist, a witch in the truest sense of the word. Local legend held that she had sacrificed her own infant child to Lucifer. When the town doctor examined the baby, he found that its skull had been impaled by a large sewing needle. Bathsheba was arrested but later acquitted due to lack of evidence. She lived out the rest of her life on that farm, a pariah, feared and hated by the community. When she died in 1863, the coroner wrote that upon examining her body, it was as if she had turned to stone. The legend said she had cursed the land, vowing to haunt anyone who tried to live there, especially the mistresses of the house. She saw my mother, Carolyn, as a rival for control of the home, and Bathsheba began to attack her. It started with pinches and slaps from an unseen hand. My mother would suddenly cry out in pain and a red welt would appear on her skin. Then came the physical torment. One afternoon, she was resting on the sofa when she suddenly screamed. A searing, piercing pain shot through her calf. When my father rushed to her side, they saw blood seeping through her slacks. Underneath, there was a perfect, circular puncture wound, deep and bloody, as if she had been impaled with a large, sharp knitting needle. There was nothing on the couch, nothing on the floor. The wound had come from nowhere. From that day on, my mother was a different person. The vibrant, joyful woman we knew began to fade away, replaced by a pale, terrified shadow of her former self. She lived in a constant state of fear, her eyes always darting towards the dark corners of the rooms. She was being relentlessly hunted in her own home, and we were all powerless to stop it. The second malevolent entity was something else entirely. It was a darker, more primal force that resided in the cellar. We never saw it, but we felt it. The cellar was its domain. The air down there was thick, foul, and felt physically heavy. Even my father, who had to go down there to tend to the furnace, would do so with a sense of profound dread, getting in and out as quickly as possible. He described it as a feeling of pure, suffocating evil. It was this entity that was responsible for the violent shaking, for the deep, guttural groans that would emanate from the earth, and for the feeling of being physically pushed or held down. Life became a war of attrition. We learned the house's rhythms. We knew not to go into certain rooms after dark. We knew that at 5:15 a.m., the beds would start to shake. We learned to sleep through the disembodied screams and the sound of furniture being dragged across the floorboards in the rooms below us. We were children, living in a haunted house that was actively trying to destroy our mother. We were trapped. My father's job didn't pay enough to just pick up and leave. The house was all we had. It was our dream, and it had become our curse. The breaking point, the moment my parents knew they couldn't fight this alone, came during a particularly awful night. My mother had been tormented for hours by Bathsheba's presence. She could feel her in the room, smell her foul stench, hear her whispering vile obscenities right in her ear. Exhausted and terrified, she finally fell into a fitful sleep. She was then jolted awake by a terrifying pressure on her chest. Her eyes shot open, and she saw it. Hovering over her in the darkness was the apparition of the hag. Its face a mask of ancient hatred, its gnarled hands reaching for her throat. My mother screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror that brought my father and all of us girls running. The next day, my mother made a call. It was a call born of sheer desperation, to a couple whose names she had seen in the newspaper. They were paranormal investigators. a field that was barely understood at the time. Their names were Ed and Lorraine Warren. When the Warrens arrived, it was like a scene out of a movie. Ed was this stocky, no-nonsense man, a self-taught demonologist. He carried himself with an air of authority, his eyes constantly scanning, analyzing. Lorraine was something else entirely. She was quiet, gentle, but as soon as she stepped out of the car, her entire demeanor changed. She physically recoiled as if she'd walked into a wall. She stopped at the edge of the driveway, her face pale. She looked at my mother and said, in a low, urgent voice, "I can feel it from here. There is a malignant presence in this house. Its name is Bathsheba." Just hearing her say the name sent a shockwave through us. We had never told anyone that name. Lorraine walked into the house, and it was like watching a psychic medium on high alert. She would stop in certain spots, her hand going to her head. "There was a suicide in this room," she'd say, pointing to a storage area. "A man hanged himself in the barn." She was seeing the history of the house, the layers of tragedy and death that had soaked into its very timbers. But it was Bathsheba she feared the most. "She sees herself as the mistress of this house," Lorraine explained, her voice trembling slightly. "And she resents you, Carolyn. She wants you gone. She wants you dead." Ed set up his equipment, tape recorders, cameras, trying to capture evidence of what we had been living with for years. They decided to hold a séance, or more accurately, a session to try and make contact and understand what we were dealing with. It was one of the single most terrifying nights of my life. We all gathered in the main living room. Ed began asking questions into the empty air, while Lorraine, in a light trance, tried to channel what was there. The temperature in the room plummeted. The air grew thick and foul with that all too familiar stench of decay. Then, Lorraine began to speak, but it wasn't her voice. It was a raspy, guttural sound, filled with ancient rage. Through Lorraine, Bathsheba spoke. She cursed us. She threatened us. She spoke of her devotion to Satan and the power he gave her over this land. And then it happened. My mother, who had been sitting quietly, suddenly let out a low moan. Her body went rigid, her head snapped back, and she began to speak in a language none of us understood. It sounded ancient, guttural, and utterly inhuman. Her body then lifted from the chair, hovering several inches in the air for a few horrifying seconds before crashing back down. Chaos erupted. Ed Warren started shouting prayers, holding a crucifix towards my mother. My father, seeing his wife being tormented, was screaming. We girls were huddled in a corner, crying, witnessing our mother being violated by an unseen force. But the worst was yet to come. The Warrens concluded that the only way to save my mother was to perform an exorcism. Because the Catholic Church was slow to sanction such a rite, Ed, fearing for my mother's life, decided to perform one himself. It was not an official exorcism. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble performed in our own living room. I am not going to describe the full details of what happened that night. Not because I don't remember them. They are burned into my memory like a brand, but because some things are too horrible to put into words. It was not a holy ritual. It was a battle, a violent, physical, and spiritual war fought over my mother's body and soul. My mother's body contorted into impossible shapes. She spoke in that same demonic voice, taunting Ed, taunting my father, revealing secrets about everyone in the room that she could not possibly have known. Her strength was supernatural. It took my father and 2 other men to hold her down as she thrashed and fought. Objects flew across the room, hurled by an invisible force. The entire house seemed to groan and shake around us, as if the very gates of hell had opened in our living room. We children were there. We saw it all. We saw our mother, the person who was our entire world, twisted into a vessel for pure, unadulterated evil. The fear and trauma of that night is something that none of us will ever recover from. In the end, the ritual was too much. Seeing the agony his wife was in, my father, in a fit of rage and despair, threw the Warrens out of the house. He screamed at them to leave, that they were making it worse. He was right. The exorcism hadn't worked. It hadn't cleansed the house. It had just made the entity, it had just made Bathsheba angrier. The Warrens left, and we were alone again, trapped in the house that hated us. The years that followed were a kind of grim truce. The overt, violent activity lessened, But the presence never left. It was as if, having shown us its full power, it was now content to simply watch us, to torment us with its constant, suffocating presence. We lived there for another 9 years. 9 more years of cold spots, of disembodied whispers, of the constant feeling of being watched by malevolent eyes. We were too financially broken to leave. We had to learn to coexist with the evil in our home. We became prisoners of the Arnold estate. We finally moved out in 1980. I remember the last day, packing the final box into the moving truck. I took one last look at the house. It stood there on the hill, gray and silent, just as it had the first day we saw it. It looked the same, but we were all irrevocably changed. We were a family shattered by a trauma that no one else could possibly understand. The house had taken my mother's joy, my father's spirit, and all of our innocence. I've never been back. Other families have lived there since. And I've heard stories that the activity continues, though perhaps not with the same intensity. Maybe the house found what it wanted in us. Maybe it just needed to break a family to satisfy its hunger for a while. To this day, I don't sleep well in the dark. I can't. Every creak of a floorboard, every shadow in the corner of my eye, sends a jolt of that old, familiar fear through me. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I'll catch a faint, sweet smell of rotting flowers. And I still have this recurring feeling, a cold certainty that crawls up my spine, that I'm being watched. I know that what we experienced was real. I know that evil is a tangible thing, and that it can attach itself to a place, to a person. We didn't just live in a haunted house. We were the ones who were haunted. And in a way, I think a part of us never really left that farmhouse in Harrisville. The house chose us, and it never truly let us go.